This is Mr. Vinord, not Mr. Beamer, which I'm sure for some of you is a shock. This is the intro to chapter 22, and here's why. When I was a seventh grade history student back in the 1970s with Mr. Roy Gherkin, who happens to be Mrs. Jeske's father, or no, it'd be grandpa-in-law. How about that? He had us for an assignment recite word for word the Gettysburg Address. We had to stand next to his desk and recite the Gettysburg Address. So I'm going to read the Gettysburg Address. My memory is pretty good with a lot of things, but I can't remember the address word for word. But I am going to read the Gettysburg Address, which is one of the great American documents of our history. Here we go. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We have met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that this nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who have struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they have fought here, have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we have highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Abraham Lincoln, November 19, 1863.
All right, with that said, let's get into some history. Let's get fired up. The first section is Bull Run ends the 90-day war. All right, for A push, the battles you should know are usually the first battle, the turning point battles, and usually the last battle for the major wars. And so the first battle of the Civil War is Bull Run. So Bull Run was located in Northern Virginia, and here it is on the map right here, July 1861, so a few months after Fort Sumter. Now, most Northerners did expect the war to last only 90 days, okay, and then the war would be over. The North would crush the South in 3 months, and the war would be done. Bull Run showed the North that it was not going to be an easy fight. And so the atmosphere was so odd at Bull Run, people came to watch. So people brought picnic lunches, they had dresses on, they were excited to watch the battle, which is nuts if you think about it. And so what they witnessed was shocking to these people. The Confederacy won. The North had to run away. They were panicking, and the Confederacy, I would highlight this, won the Battle of Bull Run. And the key point is it showed the North that it's not going to be a short war, it's going to last a long time. All right, we know that I love maps, and here's, again, a map of the United States during the Civil War. And so the gray-colored states, these are slave states, but we know that 4 of them, 5 if you count West Virginia, did side with the Union. So the border states of Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, they had slaves, but they did side with the Union. And so the question I have on here is all the battles did occur in the South. Okay, Fort Sumter, the first one was in South Carolina. All the battles of the Civil War occurred in the South except for 2. And those are probably the 2 most important battles of the Civil War we'll talk about in this section. Next section is Tardy George. Tardy George, was he late? Yeah, well, he was a little bit late. George McClellan and the Peninsula Campaign of 1862. You need to know this guy's name, George McClellan. He was the commander of the Army of the Potomac. So George McClellan was the leader of the Northern forces for part of the Civil War. And eventually Lincoln is very unhappy with him and replaces McClellan later on. So McClellan, some of his characteristics, George McClellan was an excellent drill master, very organized. He was a perfectionist, though, and so he was very detailed in his leading. He always was nervous and paranoid that he was always outnumbered, so he was very cautious as a general. And he held the Northern Army for months without advancing. So he was afraid to attack the South. Lincoln said that he had the slows. Kind of interesting if you think about it. McClellan had the slows. So the Union does attempt to capture the capital at Richmond. That was the initial goal. So we'll get this done in 3 months. McClellan's going to take his forces down to Virginia, capture the capital of Richmond, and the war would be over. However, this does not work, and the North now turns to a divide and conquer strategy. So because the North could not capture Richmond easily, they decided to do a total war strategy. Basically, they're going to have a blockade and then divide and conquer the South. And so here, these 6, you don't have to memorize them. I would just have an idea of what the North wanted to eventually win this war. Okay, the first strategy was to have the blockade, and the North was relatively successful with that. Then they wanted to free the slaves to try to undermine their economy, which leads to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Then out west, we wanted to control the Mississippi River, and we eventually are able to do that. And the Union general who controls them, we'll learn about later, but here's a hint. He is a future president of the United States. He likes cigars as well. We'll get to that. The next one, number 4, is to cut the Confederacy to pieces by marching through Georgia and the Carolinas, basically destroying all the resources, and we actually do that as well. Very famous general, his march to the sea. We'll learn about that later. Eventually capture Richmond, which we'll eventually do, and then eventually destroy the South's armies, because if they have no soldiers to fight, the South will eventually surrender. All right, next section, the war at sea. The Union does blockade. It started off poorly, but eventually it's successful in preventing the South from getting resources from Britain and France. And Britain does not really interfere much with the blockade. Again, Uncle Tom's Cabin helps Britain from not partaking in helping the South. There is some blockade running going on. There's some smuggling of materials in and out of the South. It's a profitable business for many in the South. However, it was not extremely successful. I would highlight these two. This is a famous naval battle of the Civil War, the Merrimack of the Confederacy versus the Monitor and Union. These are the first ironclad naval battle in American history, these two ships. So the Confederacy did have an ironclad, and so did the Union. The final result was basically a draw, but the lesson learned is that the ships in the future are going to have to be steam-powered and made of iron. These ironclads are going to be important. Wooden ships will become a thing of the past. All right, now we're going to get into some turning points and the two of the most important battles of the Civil War. And the first one is this one right here called Antietam. This happens in September of 1862, so about a year and a half into the Civil War, and this is one of the most important battles that you need to know. All right, so some background. Lee, General Lee, who was a commander of the South, he hoped to advance into the North and hopefully persuade the border states to join the South, because if the border states joined the South had a much better chance. And so he goes into Maryland. That is where the Battle of Antietam occurs, to try to win some battles, to try to get the people of Maryland to join the South's cause. Also, and this is a key thing, Lee said that if we could win in the North, if we could win at Antietam, foreign countries might intervene in the war. France and Great Britain might actually help out the South and give them resources. All right, so Lincoln actually brings back Mr. Slows, George McClellan. He's back again, and he'll come back again later. So McClellan is back in charge at Antietam, and I would highlight this. Antietam is the deadliest one-day battle of the Civil War. 23,000 casualties happened on this September day in 1862, one of the saddest days in American history. The battle does end in a draw. I would highlight this as well. So there's no clear winner, but I guess the key thing is Lee, the leader of the Southern forces, is forced to retreat back across the Potomac into Virginia. So it is a draw, but Lee does take his Southern troops back across the Potomac. So the results of this, you already must know in A push. Okay, so you must know that after Antietam, Lincoln is able to write the Emancipation Proclamation. Again, one of the most important documents written in American history. And so now he is going to make the cause of the Civil War, not just to save the Union, but also to free slavery, to free the slaves. So this adds the moral cause to the war. So after Antietam, Lincoln writes the Emancipation Proclamation. And then number two, just as important, Antietam prevents foreign intervention on the side of the Confederacy. If Lee would have won at Antietam, France and or Great Britain might have helped the South, potentially causing the end of the Civil War for the North. Please ignore my family yelling at each other in the background. All right, a proclamation without emancipation. That's kind of a weird heading, and it's about Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And we mentioned that he wrote it shortly after the Battle of Antietam, and then he issued it for January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, a must-know. And so now this basically makes the war, wasn't just to save the Union, but it was also to free the slaves. So he makes it a moral cause for the Civil War. And I would highlight this. It gave a moral purpose to end slavery, as well as the political purpose of restoring the Union. And I think the next phrase is kind of interesting. So where Lincoln could, he would not. And where he would, he could not. Okay, so he's talking about slavery. So where Lincoln could, in the border states, he could free the slaves there. He had the power to do that. But he would not do that. He did not free the slaves in the border states. He freed the slaves in the Deep South, or in the Confederacy, but he had no power to free them. Okay, so the proclamation freed the slaves in the not yet conquered southern territories, and it did not free the slaves in the border states. Okay, blacks battle bondage. So African Americans originally did not enlist in the army, but because of the high death toll, more soldiers were needed. So African Americans did join the Union Army. About 10% of the enlisted Union soldiers were African Americans. So that's quite a large percentage of African Americans fighting for the Union. Probably what made it even more scary for African Americans is up until 1864, the Confederacy refused to recognize blacks as prisoners of war. Okay, and many times the Confederacy treated them terribly. They executed them as runaway or rebels. And one of the worst examples was at Fort Pillow Massacre in Tennessee. Some African Americans surrendered formally, but were massacred anyway by the Confederate leaders. And the Confederate leader at the Fort Pillow Massacre was a guy named Nathan Bedford Forrest. Okay, and this guy is one of the worst Americans ever. And after the Civil War, he becomes the leader of the Ku Klux Klan. And then, like 100 years later, he has a great grandson named Forrest Gump. I'm kidding. Okay, finishing up. Many Southern blacks, they were slaves, but they did not leave the South when they heard of the Emancipation Proclamation. A big reason why these Southern blacks did not leave is because they couldn't. Okay, they weren't allowed to. Some of them were afraid if they tried to leave, they'd be captured and killed, so they stayed there with their master. Okay, many Southern blacks did leave, however, when the Union Army came. So when our army came through the South and liberated and freed the slaves, they did join the side of the Union. All right, this document shows the Fort Pillow Massacre, again, that happened in 1864. The document was created in 1885. And if you look at just the details, here's the Confederate flags. These are Confederate soldiers. And then over here you have African Americans. Some of them look like they're soldiers, but some of them appear to be women as well. And it looks like they have no weapons, so it's a pretty vivid illustration. All right, the last section is Lee's last lunge at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 1863. And Gettysburg is just a must-know and A-push. It is also a turning point with Antietam. That we have two turning points during the Civil War, and this happens in Pennsylvania in July of 1863. So Lee, a year or so after Antietam, prepares to invade the North again for a second and final time. He meets General George Meade of the North. Again, you don't need to know him. But this battle at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania is a 3-day battle, July 1 to July 3rd, 1863. And this is a turning point because after this battle, the South is devastated. The South never had a chance to win after the Battle of Gettysburg. Perhaps you've heard of Pickett's Charge. Robert E. Lee ordered Major General George Pickett to go up Cemetery Ridge on the 3rd day of the Battle of Gettysburg, and it was a slaughter, and most of his forces from the South were just destroyed. And again, this marks the beginning of the end for the Confederacy during the Civil War. So again, Gettysburg is the turning point in the East. And in the second half of chapter 22, we'll look at the turning point in the West. Then finally, months later, November 19th, 1863, and you don't have to know that date, but Lincoln does deliver maybe his most famous speech, the Gettysburg Address, which was given by Mr. Venord, the first part of the video. And again, in the Gettysburg Address, added the moral purpose to the war, to fight to end slavery. 7 years ago. Again, I love maps, and so this is some of the major battles during the Civil War, and we're going to focus on two. The two most important ones in the East, the turning point battles, are right here: Antietam in September of 1862. Then Gettysburg was the most northern battle. It's when Robert E. Lee sent his forces up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and that was July 1863, basically July 3rd. So the next day was the 4th of July, and these are the two turning point battles in the East. And in the next video, we'll talk about the West. And I wonder which one is the turning point in the West. I got a feeling it's on a river.